The honourable member for Timmins James Bay.
It's a great honour to rise in this House representing the people of Timmins James Bay and to speak on Bill C-52, an act to amend the Canada Transportation Act and the Railway Safety Act. Mr. Speaker, trains play a huge role in the life of our country and the history of our country, and for any boy growing up, the thing we all wanted to be when we grew up was a train. And I spent my life on the Ontario Northland as a kid. My great-grandfather used to be the conductor on the Sydney Flyer in Nova Scotia, and he lived in Iona. Now, Iona is a little village in Cape Breton, and they used to say that the only two things that you could find in the village of Iona were Holy Days and McNeil's. So my grandfather was a McNeil, and so John P. McNeil was a conductor on the Sydney Flyer, and John P.'s great skill, Mr. Speaker, was that he could spot bootleggers on the platform, and his eye for a bootlegger was never wrong, because he always said that a man carrying a bottle of whiskey with his underwear in a bag put that bag down with just a little bit more care than if there was no whiskey in the bottle. My uncles all worked on the Ontario Northland train out of North Bay and Mattawa. In those days, you either worked in Northern Ontario, you worked underground in the mines, as my grandfather McNeil did and my grandfather Angus did, or be like my uncles working on the Northlander. I had a famous uncle who apparently used to drink a 26er every night on the run from North Bay to Timmins, and they said he was never worse for wear, although some nights after a 26er he'd say that it was like the same as working 21 straight hours and just being very tired. He didn't live long enough for me to be around, but they used to tell us stories about being on those trains. And in my own family, I actually live, my street address, Mr. Speaker, is mileage 104, which is 104 miles on the Ontario Northland Railway track. So every morning, there's that beautiful, beautiful sound of the train whistle going past my house, shaking everything in the foundations. It used to carry people, but it doesn't carry people anymore because the provincial Liberal government of Kathleen Wynne decided that people in Northern Ontario are truly second-class citizens and don't merit public transit. Public transit is something that belongs in urban areas and to urban voters, but people in Northern Ontario are somehow second-class. And so the Liberal government set out to destroy a 100-year-old public institution, which is the Ontario Northland Transportation Commission. So what passes by my house daily now is the wood going south, the way the wood has always gone south. Tanker cars full of sulfuric acid from the smelter in Rouyn-Noranda, Quebec. They used to carry product from the smelter in Timmins, but the Liberal government also allowed that to be killed because of their idiotic hydro pricing. So we're used to seeing things being shipped out of our region on train, but we used to be able to ship our people back and forth. And Mr. Speaker, just this past weekend, I had the great honor and great joy of traveling on the VIA train between Toronto and Ottawa, and again, it was just like being a little kid again, getting on the train, the smell of the train, the feel of the train, the conductors. I just felt the same excitement, but I felt a real sense of sadness that for so many regions of our country, the idea of a coherent national transit strategy, including train, is being seen as somehow something that belongs in the 19th century as opposed to a very, very 21st century method of travel. And I do hope to see that in the near future, when a new Democratic government is elected in Ontario and we get rid of that corrupt Liberal government, that we restore proper train transportation into our region. And then certainly Ontario Liberals could learn with their right-wing austerity premier that she will be a footnote in history like Alison Redford, having promised to be a progressive premier and then turning her back. But certainly we see from our colleagues in Alberta how you can elect a progressive woman and actually get it. Mr. Speaker, I want to speak today about the importance of the safety transportation changes that are coming, that need to happen, because we've seen an enormous shift in the movement of goods over the last 5 years. There's been a 28,000% increase in the transportation of fuels from Western Canada, particularly on the rail lines. And they're carrying fuel from the Bakken fields, which we know is highly combustible, It's carrying diluted bitumen. It's carrying heavy crude. And so the incredible increase of this transportation on the transit system raises serious questions about issues of safety, particularly when we see the tragedy at Lac Mégantic. However, Mr. Speaker, warnings about a potential rail tragedy have been discussed in Parliament for many, many years. I certainly remember being here in 2004 and trying to get the Liberal government of Paul Martin to see some common sense, which they refused to see at the time, because the Liberal government believed that if you privatized or if you allow companies to look after themselves, if you get rid of inspectors and you save money to government, that'll somehow make things a lot better. And so the Liberal government brought in changes to the Railway Safety Act. They went to the whole self-management system and told us this was the future, just like they were telling us at that time, Mr. Speaker, that they could do the same thing for the banking rules. The push at that time was to change Canada's banking laws in order to allow the banks to self-regulate. And we were told here in the House of Commons the NDP were somehow the nanny state NDP, because we said you need to have rules around banking. But at the time, my Liberal colleagues thought that the great future were places like Citibank and the whole amalgamation and investment that was happening in the United States, and we saw how that ended up. So in good times, it's easy to say you don't need regulation. In good times, it's easy to say that let everything happen and things will carry on. But we know our role as legislators is to make sure that we have basic rules in place to protect people from potential accidents. So after the changes that came in under the Liberals in terms of self-management, we find that there was a whole series of increases in accidents, but because they were being self-managed, they didn't even bother to report them. That what came from the Transportation Safety Board in 2005 said that they became suspicious of CN's accident numbers as compared to other operators. That all of a sudden there was this wide discrepancy in the numbers of derailments or lack of derailments, and it turned out that over 1,800 derailments and accidents were simply not reported, including 44 that were on key rail arteries. So why do we have oversight? Because we want to make sure that when companies are self-regulating, they aren't doing what was happening at that time, which is simply not bothering to report. And this is a very serious issue, particularly in light of the accidents we've seen recently. In my region, in Northern Ontario, we've had 3 serious train derailments on the rural subdivision at Hornpain and 2 at Gogama. Now, the incidents, the last 2 were February 14th and March 7th, with CN freight trains carrying between 94 and 100 cars. Now, the March 17th train was 6,089 feet long. That's a staggering amount of crude oil that was being carried on that track. So they had come on the rural subdivision exists between Capreol in the south towards Sudbury and Hornpain. It's primarily composed of a continuous welded rail and is classified as Class 4 track under the transportation safety rules. Now, Class 4 is the second highest rating, which means that it allows trains to travel 60 miles an hour for freight and 80 miles an hour for passenger trains, but we don't see much passenger trains anymore in the north. But there were a number of slow orders given because of problems along that track. So we had the accident on February 14th at Gogama, and then again on March 17th. Now, at the time of the March 7th derailment, March 7th was the second derailment, the eastbound freight was moving at 43 miles an hour, and at 2:40 in the morning, the temperatures of -10, it jumped the tracks, and cars were spilled into the Matagami River. Now, what was very disturbing about the 700 feet of track that was destroyed at Matagami River at that junction there and the cars going in is that a great deal of work has happened in our region in terms of the Matagami River, which is one of the great northern river systems feeding into James Bay, that a lot of work has been done to secure fisheries, to build up the spawning grounds. So having heavy crude pouring in and burning across that river system was certainly deeply, deeply disturbing for residents of my region who right across that see that as one of the great river systems of northern Ontario. So the issue of transportation safety, given the huge amount of increase in combustible fuels that are being transported on trains, is very serious, because in many of our communities were built on the rail line, Mr. Speaker, so that those trains actually travel through the centre of so many communities across Western Canada and Northern Ontario. We see in Sudbury sitting there at the lights as those cars are speeding by. If the derailment that happened at Gogama had happened in an urban area, it could have been a tragedy on the nature of Lac-Mégantic. So what do we do then to alleviate this? Well, Mr. Speaker, whenever you talk about the transportation of dangerous goods, whether it's through a pipeline or whether it's by rail, you have to ensure that there's rules in place for oversight and for public safety. So there are some very positive elements of this bill, which I want to say the New Democrats will be supporting, in terms of putting in place the minimum insurance levels for railways transporting dangerous goods based on the type and volume of goods that are being transported, and also the establishment of a disaster relief fund to deal with accidents such as what we'd seen at Lac-Mégantic. We've also seen a number of changes, including increased powers for inspectors, and this is important to have. Now, is this enough? Well, given the potential damage caused by a catastrophic train derailment, perhaps not. And this is something that we do need to speak to, because it's the issue of polluter pay is a fundamental principle that Canadians agree with, Mr. Speaker, that improving rail liability and accountability, we don't want the public on the hook for any potentially catastrophic disaster. So the question is how do we move to a regime that we establish that it is still a profitable system to be able to move transportation by rail, because we want to make sure that rail remains a profitable system, but that the public is assured of that in case of liability, we won't have fly-by-nighters that happen at Lac-Mégantic suddenly say they don't have any money and wanting to skip town. That's not good enough, not when lives are at stake and not when the environment's at stake. So essentially, Bill C-52 requires minimum insurance levels for a railway for transporting dangerous goods and establishes a disaster relief fund paid by crude shippers. But the issue of minimum insurance levels from $25 million transporting minimum goods up to a maximum of $1 billion for a railway transporting substantial qualities. The question is how, at what point are we going to get to a level within this fund that we actually have the kind of money that would be necessary to offset a potential disaster? Now, I'd like to compare, Mr. Speaker, what we had with Gogama with the situation in Kalamazoo. Now, in the Kalamazoo blowout, it was a pipeline. It was not a rail disaster, but it was carrying, that pipeline was carrying raw bitumen. And what we saw with the Kalamazoo disaster was that when that bitumen hit the water, cleaning it up wasn't so simple. In fact, it's cost over $1 billion in an attempt to remediate the situation in the Kalamazoo River from bitumen, because bitumen is a very, very difficult and dangerous product to deal with, especially when it sinks and it gets to the bottom, and the chemicals that are involved make it a very, very different issue. So whether we're talking about pipelines or rail, we get back to one of the root issues, which is we need to move towards upgrading at source as much as possible to limit the potential for environmental damage. Also, we ensure that whatever we produce in Canada in terms of natural raw materials, we're seeing the benefit as much as possible. We need to be able to move towards having discussions in this House of Commons about how we limit the environmental damage from such massive projects, because we are in a world that is dealing with the potential for catastrophic climate change, and we've seen a government that has completely literally buried their heads in the oil sands, refusing to deal with their international obligations. But we do, as Canadians, need to deal with this. This is something that Canadians feel very inspired to take action, and we've seen with the recent New Democratic Party win in Alberta. People in Alberta are deeply concerned about the issue as well. How do we do development sustainable? How do we limit the impact of greenhouse gases? How do we ensure that if we're doing the transportation of our incredible natural resources that we're blessed with right across this country, that we're getting the maximum benefit, so we're not just a place where the ground is ripped up and shipped out to refineries in Texas or over to China, but they were actually able to benefit from it. So these are all interrelated issues, Mr. Speaker, that really, really need to be discussed in Parliament, and we need to have a national conversation about where we're going for this. Now, I would like to say that this, in response to the situation in Lac-Mégantic, is a good first step. Like I said, we certainly have many questions in terms of our position here in the New Democratic Party about whether the liability, whether this insurance is enough. We certainly question some of the numbers. But for the 200,000 barrels of oil transported daily, Transport Canada estimates that oil levies will contribute about $17 million annually to general revenues. Now, this is a step forward, but there's certainly outstanding concerns because we'd need to have this levy in place for about 15 years before we reach the $250 million generation level point that they actually believe would be able to respond to any level of crisis. And I would just again point, in Lac-Mégantic, it cost $400 million, the damage that was done from that one accident. So certainly this levy wouldn't be enough. Under the legislative summary that we received from the Library of Parliament, the Act amends the Railway Act to allow a province or municipality that incurs costs in responding to a fire that is, in the opinion, was a result of a rail company's railway operations to apply to the Canada Transportation Agency to have those costs reimbursed by the rail company. That's an important role, but we also need to work closer with municipalities who are very concerned about the kind of dangerous goods that are being transported in their communities and needing to have plans to make sure that if something did blow out, for example, in Toronto when that rail line comes through, right through parts of the city, that we're all working together on this. Now, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities certainly supports what the New Democrats have been saying, and they are interested in the issues of insurance and liability. They want, as they said, Brad Woodside, who's their president, says they will call for a comprehensive approach that makes railways and crude oil shippers pay for the full cost of railway disasters and not leave municipalities or taxpayers footing the bill. That's a fundamental principle, that it shouldn't be the taxpayers of this country that are subsidizing these operations. These operations need to be profitable in their own right, and they need to carry the cost of the potential damage through proper insurance. Now, the Railway Association of Canada believes that the compensation fund should not only cover the cost of crude oil, but cover other dangerous goods such as chlorine, which I think is a very interesting element. Certainly in my region on the rail lines, they're carrying tanker cars full of sulfuric acid. And I remember, Mr. Speaker, a number of years ago when the O&R line went over just south of Temagami and pretty much destroyed a lake because of the amount of sulfuric acid that entered the water. These rail lines are carrying very, very, very dangerous goods at times, and we need to have that overall policy. Now, the Canadian Transportation Agency has said the tragic derailment in Lac-Mégantic has raised important questions regarding the adequacy of third-party liability insurance coverage to deal with catastrophic events, especially for smaller railways. This is another important issue in terms of what we saw at Lac-Mégantic, where we had a small fly-by-night company that when the damage was done simply wasn't going to be around the next day to deal with it. So, Mr. Speaker, I want to move towards closure here in my discussion. That this improvement of rail safety, this creating of a fund is important, but we do still need to have that conversation about how to ensure that the industry is covering off its own costs so that municipalities, provinces, the federal government are not on the hook. We need to make sure that the federal government maintains an active role. After those years when the Liberal government allowed self-regulation and we saw numerous increases in accidents and a decline in rail safety, we need to make sure that there's independent inspectors and that the companies are accountable. And finally, in conclusion, we do need to continue this national conversation about how we're going to process oil, bitumen, and other natural resources in our country. Thank you.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Winnipeg North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate many of the comments that were put on the record from the member, with the great exception, of course, to the opportunities he had taken to slam the Liberal Party, of course, as some might applaud that. But, Mr. Speaker, there's no doubt that the rail industry is a critical pillar industry for Canada. And it's an area in which we cannot really afford to make mistakes. Canadians, justifiably so, are very much concerned about the issue of rail line safety. They want the government to have sound regulations and laws to ensure that our communities are in fact protected. If I just reflect on Winnipeg alone, where we have the CN yards or the CP yards, which is borders the south end of Winnipeg North. These are very important job creators. They provide all sorts of opportunities in terms of shipping. The question that I have for the member is that we recognize the important role the rail line industry is, but if we want to be able to see it to continue to grow into the future, would he not agree that it is time that we spend more energy and resources in debate here in the House, ensuring that we do have the safest possible lines throughout the country?
The honourable member for Timmins James Bay.
Well, thank you. I want to thank my honourable colleague for his question. It is essential that we maintain public confidence in the rail system, because the rail system, again, sometimes people think it was a 19th century idea that brought the country together. It needs to be seen as a 21st century means of communication, not just for the transportation of goods and product coming from Western Canada, but the reimagining of a national vision for transportation for people. Because in my region in Northern Ontario, I'll give an example. My colleague mentioned his community of Winnipeg. Our roads are in brutally dangerous conditions because of the privatization of highway maintenance under the provincial Liberal government, and people don't have confidence, but they had confidence traveling that train, and the train would get through in blizzards where the road traffic is often shut down, and we see an enormous increase. As much as we talk about the increase in transportation of goods on rail, we've seen an incredible increase of transportation on the highways. And these are issues of safety, so we do need to debate. I agree with my colleague. We do need to debate in this House. How do we have systems of transportation that keep people safe and keep the confidence of industry in our country?